All right, good. So let's get started. Just tell me a bit, Bill, about your early life and your education.
Right. I grew up in Scarsdale, New York. I was the second person born in 1928 in New York State, so my mother got a fur coat and a few things like that. January 1st, 1928. And I grew up in Scarsdale High School. Went 4 years to the high school. I was not chairman of the board, but president of the student body. And I think in those days you picked a college and you applied, and you didn't apply to 12 colleges. So I just applied to Yale because a friend of mine, he was applying and his father had gone there, and I didn't know much about any of the, my father had gone to NYU, and I didn't have, and he suggested that I try to get into one of the three leading colleges. We didn't have any idea that Stanford existed. So it was Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, and I thought Harvard was a little too intellectual for me, and Princeton was a little too social for me, so Yale sounded right in the middle, and that's literally how I made my decision. Applied there, got in, and then about a year and a half later, middle of my sophomore year, I decided to take what would now be called a gap year. And I took, I went into the Army voluntarily, even though the World War II was over.
What year
Korea hadn't started.
What year was this?
That would have been about 1946 and a half, maybe, something like that, 47 maybe. And I did that for a year and a half, but it only cost me a year out of college because I had gone in the summer in those years. Because everybody was coming back from the war, we had 1,500 people in the class, and that's the largest class that'll ever go through Yale, or ever has anyway. And and so I had a great time at college. I loved college, but that maturing experience that I had when I was with the 82nd Airborne helped me, I think, a lot in my last years at Yale. And then I went right to Harvard Business School. From there, in those days, you kind of went right from college to business school. There wasn't any 2 years out to work for a company. I knew nothing about business. Took General Daurio's course, which was called manufacturing. Had nothing to do with manufacturing, but he was very inspirational. And then I ended up with a very, I should say that I got called back into the Army because I had a reserve commission, and it took me to Korea during the war, the Korean War. I was a second lieutenant and went out to front line and spent 9 months in Korea. There was a good friend of mine who went with me. I met him in Japan. We spent a couple of weeks there before going over to Korea, and when we got across up to the front line, he went to one company, I went to another, and at age 24, we were both same age, his life was snuffed out, and I have had a very exciting and varied career. And I've often thought how luck plays big time in everybody's life. And there it was just a matter of which company we were assigned to.
There's one other, I wanted to ask you on that point about chance in your life.
Yeah.
I remember reading that you had decided that if you won the student body president election, you'd apply to Yale.
Yeah,
And
that's
if-
true. I
And
didn't
if you
mention
didn't,
that.
you wouldn't.
That's exactly right, and that is the true story. I was going to apply to another college that had sent me a good little brochure, and I liked the sound of it. And but that's exactly right. So it's strange how luck and everything plays in. The harder you work, the luckier you get. It's true, and so it wasn't totally luck that I was elected president of the student body, but it was. But my grades were good, but not super good, and so it was a bit on the edge as to whether Yale would take me. I felt. I don't know about them. Then, then I had a good experience in Korea in the war, in the sense that I learned what it's like to be a soldier and be on the front line and see people hit and wounded and killed. And so when I say a good experience, it was an experience that you never forget. You realize that a lot of men, women are putting their lives on the line for us to keep us solid and free, and we tend to take that freedom for granted so often. So that I never forget that, particularly that one man that I went over with and became very close friends with. And I miss him, and I feel that he didn't get a fair shake. Anyway, I came back, finished at Harvard Business School, and then it was the bottom of it was kind of a recession at the time in 1954.
Can we talk for a minute? Can I just ask you about George Daurio, because you single him out in the things that I've read about you, and in the film, that Something Ventured film that you're in, Tom Perkins talks about Daurio and how influential he was. Can you talk a little bit about what having Daurio meant and how it influenced you?
Yeah, as I say, I knew nothing about business when I went to Harvard Business School. And Daurio, instead of the case method, which every other professor there taught with, he lectured. And he taught us what it really was like to be a businessman. And many people feel that he was overly pontificating and overly dramatic, but it impressed me. And so he would often say, keep your antenna up and always pay attention. He had a class to teach wives how to support their husbands, and that really their total focus in life should be supporting their husbands. Cut out Business Week articles that were appropriate, and make sure that they had his favorite drink ready for him when he came back from a hard day at the office, that kind of thing. And so my wife, rolled her eyes after taking this one. He invited all the wives to one class one day, and
so you had met Phyllis and
without
married,
the husbands.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. I had met Phyllis before that on a boat going over to Europe. That's another story, a quick decision story. I invited her to marry me 3 days after we were out on a boat going over to Europe, and she didn't accept for about 6 months, but because she had a big ring on her finger already, much bigger than the one she's wearing today, by the way. And life was good in those days. It was, kind of relaxed and fun, and nothing seemed too serious to us in those days. Anyway, I liked Daurio a lot. He gave me a distinction, which was the top mark, and helped me graduate from the school with distinction, which was a happy thing for me. And he advised me to get out of Boston. He said, in fact, advised the whole class, be sensitive to your boss, keep your antenna up, don't stay in Boston, get out where men are, and there were no women in our class, of course. Men are really working man's work, and you learn. So when I got an offer from Inland Steel to go work there, he thought that was great, get into Chicago, it's a man's town, and that kind of thing. He also had the idea of developing ideas so that once a week our group, and he broke us up, we organized our own group of 5 or 6 people, other students, to we would call ourselves the group. I think we were group 4. And we studied the steel industry. That just happened to be I had worked for Jones and Laughlin one summer in Pittsburgh, and the rest of the group thought that was modern metalworking, not steel, metalworking was our subject of a group project that everybody had at Daurio and Daurio's course, which was good. It showed people working together, which they do in business, and they have to, and getting a team effort and cooperation and all that, and sharing knowledge and specializing, dividing up the work and what have you. So that was a very good idea at Harvard, and that he had. Another one was a little more iffy, but it was a lot of fun. Every week we'd have to turn in a new idea. My idea, I can remember still, and I guess I had more than one, was to have snaps on every button so people didn't spend so much time working on their buttons. They just snapped them closed. And I've seen 1 or 2 like that, but it seems not to have caught on as a big deal in the retail business. But I always admired George Daurio. French background, never lost his French accent, cultivated, went back to France every year, started the French business school over there, European business school, and he had just a love of life and love of his students. And I was just on a program with Dick Kramlich yesterday, and in front of the YPO group, and Dick was talking about, we were both talking about Daurio, and Dick said that every time he'd meet Dick, he'd say, and this is one of my favorite students, Dick Kramlich. And Dick kept reminding him that he never was a student. He couldn't get into the class. But Daurio didn't care. He was my favorite student. He had this panache that was really great. And all the students really were excited to be in that class.
And your paths would cross later on.
So later on, he asked me to be the West Coast, me and Sutter Hill. I had already gotten Sutter Hill started. He asked me to be the West Coast operations for American Research and Development, which was his venture capital company, which he started about the time he was teaching us at the Harvard Business School. And but this was, you're right, several years after I had, well, in fact, maybe 10 years after I had left. I spent 5 years in the steel industry at Inland Steel in Chicago, and then I was asked by him to if I would be interested in doing that. And there's something in the minutes of the American Research and Development board meetings that talks about me, and the way he put it was that he wasn't sure that I would want the job, but didn't know why I'd want to be number 2. The truth is, I told him when I talked with him for a while, it was pretty evident that all the decisions were going to be made in Boston, and I was going to be sourcing them, but not deciding on much of anything. And I thought, that isn't what I want. I wanted a little more freedom in decision making and so on, and I'm glad I didn't do that. But I did very, very seriously discuss it, and before we had raised a substantial amount of money for Sutter Hill, it was a real option for me.
So we sort of had that digression, but I wanted to just close that,
that's good.
Bit with Daurio. So here you are, you're out of Harvard Business School, you go to Chicago, you're with Inland Steel. Was that what you expected it to be?
Inland Steel? It was a wonderful experience. I didn't have any real concept of what it might be, but I was asked to be one of Randall's Rangers. Clarence Randall was the chairman of the board of Inland Steel at the time, and he had just designed this program for training top management potential, and so he got me and 4 or 5 others out of good colleges to come to Inland and work in a training program. So for a year, we went around and saw every part of the company, manufacturing, in the mill, and purchasing and marketing and sales, and every part of it. And we really learned. I learned a lot in that 1 year, maybe as much as I had at business school. 4 or 5 other very sharp young guys who were really exciting to be with, good guys. Only one of them stayed. All the rest of us, after the training program somehow, not right after, I mean, I was there for 5 years, but eventually left the company. One went on to be president of the Chicago First National Bank, and Dick Thomas. And it turned out to be not many surprises because I wasn't too locked into what the whole experience would be like. I went into the sales department after the 1 year, and first I was an inside salesman, and then got to be one of 9 salesmen. They only had 9 salesmen. It was the 6th largest steel company in the country. And I was given the south side of Chicago, which arguably was the best territory, and had a great time in that regard. And then my father had met up in Europe with Fred Anderson, and they cooked up the idea of Draper, Gaither and Anderson as the first venture capital company in the West.
Now, how did you meet Pitch Johnson? Because you met at Inland Steel.
Pitch and I met at Inland Steel. We both lived in East Chicago, Indiana, and because that was the mill town where the steel was made. Right near Gary, Indiana, where U.S. Steel manufactured their steel. And Pitch worked as a foreman in the mill, in the open hearth. And I think we met almost on our first day moving into the house that we were in. We were in, our house cost $75 a month, and his cost $90 a month. And he was in a little better, fancier part of the mill town, but it was a mill town loaded with coke dust, and it had an oil refinery in the town and a cement factory, and all of that stuff came down on our cars, and talk about pollution. It was a very polluted town. East Chicago, Indiana was a bit grimy, but really solid people there. Phyllis and I shared a house with, right up the middle. We had 2nd floor and 1st floor, and a coke furnace down in the basement. 15 tons of coke would be delivered on our front, our postage stamp front lawn every 6 weeks, and I'd shovel it into the front window that opened up, and I'd shovel it down, just dropped it on the basement floor, and then I'd shovel it into the coke furnace, and that's what heated the house. And there was a great guy who raised his family in the other half of our house, and they too had a basement, first and second story. And their daughter was our babysitter and so on. And he was a crane operator. So they were really solid people in Chicago, and I got to we lived there and then moved up to Highland Park eventually when I was went into the I just bought the house in up in Highland Park, which is north, and I got assigned to the south side of Chicago, so it was about a 2-hour commute that I made every day. Left my car there in Chicago, South Chicago, and I went in by train every day and picked up the car and then drove around the various accounts and then got back on the train and went back. But life there was no problems. I mean, snowstorm, we were giving a party on New Year's Eve and a blizzard hit. And I crawled along Skokie Highway up back to home, and God, it was, I just thought I'd never get there. But it didn't bother me. I mean, if I was late for my own party, but I got there before midnight anyway, and those were really great days. And Pitch and Kathy, of course, came to but Pitch and Kathy raised their kids. We raised our kids same time, and we were very best friends. So when I came, he was from Palo Alto, California. And so he talked about it a lot, particularly when the weather was stormy.
So Chicago was a big change.
Big change. And so when my father and General Anderson came out here and tied up with Ron Gaither to start Draper, Gaither and Anderson, I was delighted to hear that it was going to be in Palo Alto. So I asked Pitch all about Palo Alto, and when Phyllis and I had driven out here in our Chevrolet, convertible Chevrolet, we got a convertible because we heard the weather was very good out here, and Pitch and Kathy came out and gave a party for us almost the second day we were here with all their friends from Stanford and from growing up in Palo Alto. So, and those friends to this day are my close friends. And of course, he was the first guy I thought of when I decided to start up my own company after working with my dad for 3 years at Draper, Gaither and Anderson.
Now, we haven't talked much about your dad yet in this oral history. Such a distinguished military career and had been in banking, right? He had been in...
That's right. He was an investment banker with Dillon Reed in New York all through the recession. He never had a lot of money because it was a tough time for investment bankers. And there was not a recession, it was the Depression. And he had to close several Dillon Reed offices in Chicago and somewhere else as a senior partner. And he scrambled to hold on to his own job in those days. He worked late nights, and I learned hard work from him pays off. And he always had, a very professional approach to problems. And that investment banking career really helped him form those very solid approach to business problems. I'm not sure the investment banking community today is quite as high quality as it was, because the trading part of it was not a big thing. It was more the investment banking and coaching senior people in big companies was part of the way they got business. So Dillon Reed was considered, right with Morgan Stanley, as the really the two top firms in the country. So his training was there, but then he kept his officers program alive. When he was in World War I, he was a second lieutenant. He kept working every summer. He'd go spend a few weeks. He'd always have his vacation would be in order to go up to Plattsburgh in New York and do various Army maneuvers. Our Buick car was taken up there, and it would come back, and they'd have tank written on a sign. So, and they had wooden guns. I mean, it was that kind of an environment in those between war years. And but he kept going, and he became a colonel, and then had a regiment during World War II. Never saw action. He was in Hawaii, and then got called back to Washington because of his investment banking career. Helped to cut back on the contracts, the war contracts, when the war was winding down, 45, let's say. He met, then he was asked by Harry Truman. Well, he worked as General Clay's economic advisor in Berlin right after the war. I mean, almost the day the war was over, he was in Berlin with General Clay, who was the High Commissioner for Germany and really managed the occupation of Germany. And he was Clay's economic advisor. He also had a political advisor, and he did that for 4 years. And then he came back to Washington because he was asked to be Undersecretary of the Army by Harry Truman, which he did. And then in so that's how, I mean, he had this mixed career of business and government work, which I think guided me into doing both. But he was then asked by Harry Truman to run the Marshall Plan, say in 1950 or something like that, 49, 50. And he went back to Paris, and that's how he met Fred Anderson, because Anderson had run the 8th Bomber Command, and Harriman was really in charge of the Marshall Plan overall in Washington. But my father was asked to be the operating head of it in Europe. And Harriman suggested General Anderson, to be his, suggested him as a deputy for my dad. Anderson, having run the 8th Bomber Command, was a risk taker. He had been in Air Force all his life. He was depicted in the 12 O'Clock High by not Gary Cooper, but one of the great, the guy with the mustache and the famous love interest of every woman, but I can't think of his name right now. And he played the part in this movie of Fred Anderson's part. Anyway, Anderson and my father hit it off, and they decided that they would start up a venture capital company in the West, here in Palo Alto. They got Rowan Gaither, who had been head of the chairman of the Ford Foundation, president of the Ford Foundation, and chairman of Rand Corporation, and he had done the Gaither report for John F. Kennedy on missiles, the missile gap, so-called, which there wasn't any, and he died at the age of 50. He had an amazing career because he was also managing partner of the best law firm in San Francisco. Cooley. Now it's just Cooley, but it was Cooley, Crowley, Gaither.
So these are three
really powerhouses,
incredibly accomplished men.
Three incredibly accomplished.
And why did they come to Palo Alto, California, and decide to go into this entirely new thing called venture capital, which obviously brought you to California too?
My father used to mention venture capital to me. There was J.H. Whitney and the Rockefellers, basically, in New York, and there was Daurio in Boston. But he used to suggest to me that would be an interesting place to go. In fact, suggested I talk to J.H. Whitney about a job. He had always had his eye on that part of it, having seen it through the investment banker's eyes. Fred Anderson came back to California he knew California because he had been at the Travis Air Force Base for quite a few years. In fact, he flew an airplane right into the Pacific Ocean because he was afraid he would kill some people in San Francisco if the plane didn't make it. He had run out of gas, and he, instead of going over the city, decided to dump the airplane and live through it. As I say, he's a risk taker. So he came back here and did some private investing. It used to be called Special Situations. And he had a young guy that worked with him, younger man, Larry Durig. And they were sort of getting it started after my father and he had decided they were going to do this thing. My father went to be chairman of the Mexican Light and Power Company for about 5 years. And then they raised the money from $2 million from Rockefellers, which Gaither really had the relationship with the Rockefellers. My father had the relationship with Lazard Frere. They put in $2 million. And $2 million from some individuals that all three of them knew. Mostly Anderson. And anyway, they got $6 million together and decided to start in, I don't know what day in 1959, called the fall of 1959.
That's a considerable amount of money in 1959.
$6 million was a considerable amount of money. And it was we were the only game in town. We were the only venture capital company in the West. Nobody knew the word venture capital out here. I joined them with 4 other guys, young guys. And I was then about 30 years old, and the others were, I think Don Lucas was 29. He later went on to give Oracle their first venture money. And the other 3 were all in early 30s. And we had a great time. It was just, we were all learning. They decided to put it on the Stanford campus because you could do that then. 99-year lease we had on Welch Road. Never liked the name because Welch, you know, is not the thing to do if you try and build your company on the basis of a handshake and goodwill and trust and so on.
And was there a lot of that?
Welching on that is not good.
Was that the environment? Was it a handshake and trust?
Yeah,
yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And very little, our agreements were almost handwritten to start with, although we always got Cooley to write up the documents. And we had a CPA that worked, one of the young guys, CPA, and he always went and checked the books of whoever it was we were going to invest in before we do anything. And that was a procedure that protected us from fraud and that kind of thing. But it was pretty informal, and we were first, so there was nobody to share it with, so the deal flow came in pretty well when people wanted money. Anderson had done one deal by himself, Raychem, which was a bonanza. It turns into $1 billion company, shrinkable tubing, that's a well-known company around the Bay area and around the world in those that covers insulation of wires and shrinks under heat. But that was it. And so we were looking at a lot of things. My first deal was, came to me through Reed Dennis, who was then at Fireman's Fund. And Reed was doing a few of these special situations.
And he was in San Francisco? Was he in San Francisco, or was he?
He was, whether, you know, I'm not sure whether, it was in San Francisco, Bay Area. I'm not exactly sure where the location of the Fireman's Fund was, but he was putting some of their money to work, and I think a little of his own. He suggested I go talk to Corbin Farnsworth down the street, not far from our office on Stanford campus. And it was on Oregon or something near the Oregon Expressway. And Elliot Farnsworth welcomed me, and I said, Elliot, what is a defibrillator? And he said, well, lie down, Bill. And he put this big paddle on my chest and pretended to plug it in, but he didn't do that. Anyway, he pointed out that it was going to get the heart out of fibrillation. Well, of course, that saved millions of lives ever since. That was the very first defibrillator in the world. And we later sold the company for a big gain, and it to SmithKline. It was then SmithKline in French, I think. Now it's GlaxoSmithKline. It's still operating. I saw the guy who runs that division up in Seattle. It's exciting to do something like that. Later on in Sutter Hill, we backed a company called Hybertech, and every man over 40 gets the PSA test for prostate cancer. And it not only made us a lot of money, Hybertech was a big hit, but that test saved my life. So, you know, there are some good things about venture capital beside the capital returns. It's really exciting when you back something that impacts. My latest really big home run was Skype. And when you think that Skype touches, there are 500 million people now that use Skype. And I was the first investor. And it was largely Howard Hartenbaum, who I had sent to Europe to look for some kind of good investments, and because it was pretty crowded here by that time. This was in 1995, let's say. No, we sold it in 1995, but it was the early 90s. And early 2000. It was early 2000, and I think we sold it in 2005. My son Tim suggested that he go see Kazaa, and
same guys.
Kazaa had what?
Same guys, right?
Yes, and Kazaa had gone bankrupt, so the two founders of Skype left Kazaa and went back to Stockholm, and they were writing their business plan when Howard came upon them and helped them write it, because he had been an operating entrepreneur before joining me as a venture capitalist. So to see that dramatic change and the impact that Skype and Facebook and Twitter and so on can have on the world, not only on our lives in health or in communication among businessmen, but communication at the bottom of the pyramid in Egypt, where all the people at the lowest level are able to communicate and gather together in a square and bring power and pressure on the top of the pyramid and throw Mubarak out, even though he had the army and all the control systems in place in a very tough dictatorship. So it's pretty exciting what has happened here in Silicon Valley and now many other places in the world.
Now, in the early days, it's odd for us to think about it today, but you were looking for companies to invest in, right? It wasn't just that people were coming to you because venture capital was available. Can you talk a little bit about how the environment had changed?
Johnson and I, at Draper, Gaither Anderson, a lot of people came to us. But when I left Draper, Gaither Anderson and started a small business investment company, the government loaned us $3 for every dollar that we invested.
This was 1962.
Yeah, we didn't have much. I mean, he and I borrowed 2/3 of the $75,000 that we put in to it, and we had $150,000 between us, and we were able to borrow $450,000. This is about 1962, and I had left Draper, Gaither Anderson, not because I didn't like it, but because I wanted to do my own thing, and Pitch was enthusiastic about leaving Inland Steel to get back to Palo Alto and start this new career. So the two of us were very optimistic and enthusiastic, and but nobody knocked on it. You know, the phone didn't ring. We therefore rented two Pontiacs, and we both went out and knocked on doors in the orchards, because it was still, venture capital was not a known term, literally, at all. They just didn't know it. It was not known as Silicon Valley. It was a lot of fruit orchards, and in Sunnyvale and Santa Clara and so on. And we'd go look for doors to knock on that were, that looked like they had some kind of technology or electronics, but at least they didn't say prunes. And we'd ask for the president. He'd come out, typically about our age, and we'd ask him, he'd ask, well, what do you guys do in venture capital? And he'd say, what? And then we'd explain what it was. And then he said, well, come on in and hear about my company. And we became the go-to guys in the Valley, because we really did go around and dig. So we knew just about every little company that was starting up. And the financial people in San Francisco didn't want to take that big long trip down when they'd hear about something they'd call that seemed to be growing. It might be ready for an underwriting or banking relationship. They would call us. And nobody had, I don't think they had, even big banks had many branches down in this way. But I guess the Bank of America and Wells Fargo did. But we were the kind of people that friends and friends of friends would call us to ask about these various deals. The first one we did was something called Lumatronic, a company, Joe Julie, I think he was a Stanford graduate, and he had a checkweigher, a company that made checkweighers that sorted out, say, packages of food or whatever that were underweight. They'd be knocked off so they'd be weighed at very high speed. Production line kind of thing, and never made much money on it. We didn't lose any, but he was a great guy, and we had our picture on the front page of the Palo Alto Times, which of course is not here anymore, but it used to be a very nice newspaper, local. And Pitch and I looking over this piece of equipment with Joe Julie. It's an exciting world. I mean, we had a lot of fun, and we never felt we were wasting our time. It was, Pitch was a little more operational, and I think he missed some of the operation part. So he wanted to go back into some kind of operations, I think, with Air Products or some company that he went to work with. And Paul Wythes and I knew these two guys who had a real estate company, a shopping center company. It was called Sutter Hill. And so I told Frank Lodato and Greg Peterson, both Stanford MBAs, they were brothers-in-law, that we were thinking of doing, they had just hired Paul Wythes from Harvard, from Stanford Business School. Greg and Paul had been classmates. And so I said, I understand you want to go into venture capital and we want to expand. I said, you got a lot of money and we need a Xerox machine and a receptionist. What about getting together? And Frank said, he talked to Greg and they had a board meeting and we ended up partners. They said we can make this, keep calling it Draper and Johnson. But I said, I like the name Sutter Hill. Sutter was the Sutter mine, the gold mine, and the old man Sutter, the famous 1849, and the hills of San Francisco. And Frank Lodato came up with that name. Anyway, Sutter Hill, Paul and I raised the $10 million needed to set it into action, and it was a great, continues to be a wonderful venture firm today.
And that $10 million that you raised was international money, wasn't it? Was it come from European source?
A friend of mine from Yale, Charlie Mayers, said, you ought to talk to Société Générale de Belgique if you ever need more money, because we at that time had the SBIC, and it wasn't, and some money that Sutter Hill was putting into another SBIC. We closed up one of them, so it wasn't more than a few months later that we decided we really did need more money. We were getting many more deals than we could handle that came through. So we decided we would try and raise $10 million. And so I called Charlie, and Charlie said, go. I met with the president of Société Générale de Belgique, his company, and the chairman came over for an SRI meeting, Stanford Research Institute. And I had dinner with him and a man named Max Noquin. And he said, well, we're very excited about doing technology, and we've got all these other things, but we do all our investing through a company called Genstar, which is a holding company in Canada, Montreal. So why don't you go talk to them? So I went up to Montreal and talked to a guy who was a wonderful fellow, and he was president of the company, Genstar. And so we asked him to come out to California and look at a few of our deals. Angus McNaughton was his name. Angus came out here, and I'll tell you a little story about, we showed him 4 or 5 deals up around here, and then, but our big, shining, exciting investment was in LA. We were going to put Xerox out of business. A guy from Xerox had come out and had designed a better copier. So we, the three of us went down, and we hadn't seen the new machine yet ourselves, Paul and I. So the founder of the entrepreneur said to Angus, give me $1 and I'll copy it. Angus to this day says he gave him a $100 bill, but he put the dollar or the $100 on the machine, put the cover on, and switched it on, and the whole machine caught on fire. And we had to get a fire extinguisher and put it out, or it would have burned the building down. It was a big fire. It was no small deal.
And this was your lead deal,
and this was our
right?
big deal. And Angus thought his $100 had disappeared, and I thought our $10 million had disappeared. They ended up putting in a whole $10 million. They were our only limited partner. They were a company that had a inland cement in Canada, a big house building operation in Canada, tugboat operations on both coasts, but nothing in the technology world. They gave us a $10 million check at the closing, shortly after this disaster. And it was a check, you know. Nowadays, you'd have it all. It would done right, direct, bank to bank. We carried that check, Paul and I, in San Francisco, from the closing room at Cooley Crowley Gaither over to the Wells Fargo and deposited. And holding that $10 million check, you know, we were trembling because this was big money for us and very exciting. We only ended up using about $6.5 million of it. And Angus, to this day, he moved out here. He loved the Bay Area. He lives here in the East Bay. And he plays golf a lot. He told me that 10 million, their $6.5 million investment ended up being worth just about $1 billion, almost $1 billion. And in those days, $1 billion was not small change.
And was that a first to have that kind of international capital come into the venture capital?
I think it was.
Area. I haven't seen you talk much about that, but it just struck me.
And the first time, we used the same formula that Draper, Gaither, and Anderson used, and Draper, Gaither, and Anderson had the first legal setup for investment, which was this limited partnership, where there'd be a general partner and then limited, and that was the first time it had ever been used for venture capital or any kind of investment like that. Anyway, yeah, they're I think I was going to say that was probably the first. It was the first international deal. It was the first. It was not the first time that formula of limited partnership had occurred, but it was the first time a corporation had become a limited partner in an investment banking where they lost total control of that money. In fact, at the closing, Angus said, you know, Bill, we've been thinking about it and we'd like to have a veto on your deal. I mean, you do the deals and you make the decisions, but we ought to have a veto. And so the Cooley partner, who was a great guy, said, not Jim Gaither, who later became partner of Sutter Hill, and not his father, but it was another wonderful guy. He said, you know, Bill, he had this cracky voice, you know, Bill, I think you better tell Angus that he's just not ready for venture capital. And that's exactly the way he had gone, you know, we were caucusing after that suggestion had been made. And so when he came back in the room, I said just that, look, Angus, maybe you're not ready for venture capital because we're going to just, oh, no, we want to do the deal. So we got our deal and closed.
How did you convince them? Because they had to be the first company to take this risk. How did that come together?
You know, I think they were prepared to do something. Angus was about our age. And we were all young in our early, you know, mid-30s. And I think he liked the excitement, and it wasn't a big deal for this huge company, even $10 million. I mean, Angus watches the pennies. He's a very careful, McNaughton is his last name. He's a very Scottish guy. But he was excited, I think, about California, about technology, and the word was out that things were happening out here. I think Intel by that time had started and lots of other. At Sutter Hill, we did a lot in the disk drive field, relative to computer museum here. Our first disk drive company was Century Data. They came out of IBM. They were down in Pasadena. And that did very well. And that was in the portfolio when he, I think he liked the general portfolio. And he understood that a lot of times demonstrations don't work, but they usually don't burn up. So it didn't take a lot of convincing. It took a lot of, we had good chemistry. He liked me, I liked him, and we both liked Paul. It was just Paul and me, by the way. There were no other partners in Sutter Hill at that time. And then I think he had he just liked the feel of it, and so it wasn't that hard a sale.
It was a good fit. So let's talk about 1965.
By the way, good fit is right, because they were a publicly owned company, and their earnings would be like this. You know, it was a great company, but it was cement and house building and tugboats on both coasts. All of it was choppy earnings. There was no growth look to it, although over years it grew. And it just happened that as time went by, we did a lot more for them than just turn that $10 million into, call it 900 million. We leveled out their earnings. They began to look like a growth company because somehow our big kicks would help their earnings just at the right time, and they were smoothed out. And so their GenStar stock, which they gave us some of, kept riding. I mean, that was it was a great investment for me. It turned into something that was went from 10 times earnings to 20 times earnings, or something like that.
It's interesting. I haven't seen that story told anywhere else.
No, I've never
print.
told it.
That's interesting. So 1965 to 1981, roughly, that's the Sutter Hill period. Talk a little bit. There are two things I'd like to know about this period in particular for this oral history. One of which is you developed a recipe to become a successful investor during those years because you had so much success. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you learned in the venture business during those years. And second, if you could just talk about some of your successes, about some of the investments you made that you were the most proud of.
Yeah. Sutter Hill was Paul, who was a mechanical engineer. I'm a history major at Yale, so I don't pretend to know much about technology except what I've learned through osmosis and asking good friends who are good technologists what it's all about. But Paul is a mechanical engineer, so that from Princeton and Stanford MBA. And he and I then hired two others. When we got this $10 million commitment in, and by the way, we didn't have to draw down the money. We took the whole 10 million right off the bat and deposited it, as I told you. It wasn't like it is now, you do these draws. Anyway, the $10 million came in. We decided we needed a couple more people to help us invest it. And as you point out, that went a lot farther in those days than it would today. So we hired Dave Anderson, who had an MIT degree, EE, and a very lovely guy, very, you feel comfortable with him. He's very warm-spirited, sensitive person. And Dave went to Harvard Business School, and that was his education. And he was pretty young when we hired him. I've forgotten what his business career was at that time, but then we together decided that Len Baker would make a good fit. He was a math major from Yale and then went to Stanford Business School and had work for an industrial company, Cummins Engine, built those big engines for railroads and tractors and things. And he was a very analytical person, continues to be, very precise, digs deep, very helpful to every company board he's on, and really the guy where everybody says, yeah, that's a good idea. He's the one that said, oh, wait a minute, this is what's going to happen. And then he goes through he's not always right. He's been wrong a few times. As a matter of fact, one time was a big decision, but it was my mistake, not his, where I sent him, the Rockefellers, I had brought them in on a deal that we had found and developed and priced and everything called Apollo Computer, and up in Boston. It was a big success. We ended up selling it to Hewlett-Packard, but for a big gain. And so we had brought the Rockefellers into that deal at Sutter Hill. And so I got a call from them kind of paying me back, asking if I wanted to invest in a company out here that they were just doing it. And so I sent Len Baker down to look at it. And he came back and he said, well, they kept me waiting for half an hour, and the people were pretty arrogant. And it's, after all, it's an $18 million valuation. So he's often the naysayer, but I didn't, it's my mistake. He was young in the business. He'd been with us a few months. I didn't go with him. I didn't double check and go down myself. I didn't call Rockefeller and get a little more depth in it, or connect that this was a payback for Apollo. And that company was Apple Computer. So we have lost some over the years, but Sutter Hill has had some wonderful. I mentioned Hybertech, that was a Sutter Hill deal that was very good. About three disk drive companies that were all successful: Century Data, Priam, and the biggest one of all was Quantum. 4 guys came in to see us, 4 engineers, and I said, well, this is how informal it was in those days. They didn't come in with a business plan and a PowerPoint demonstration or anything. They came in to just say, hey, we're thinking of starting a company. We need some, X dollar and maybe a couple of $1 million, and to get it going. And I said, well, who's going to be the president? Well, we haven't really talked about that. Jim, you have the least to do. Why don't you become president? He said, oh, well, okay. That's how the president of Quantum Computer got chosen, and he it went to being a $2 billion company.
All under him, as the president.
As
right.
the president.
Yeah.
And so things were a lot looser in those days. Another good investment that we made was Activision. And there'd been a couple of guys that had worked at Atari, and they wanted to do, I asked one of them, well, what are you going to do? You make a lot of money on this. What are you going to do for the long term in your life? All I want to do for the rest of my life is make games. I thought, this guy is really passionate about this. And but I could see that none of the 3 or 4 was proper to be the CEO. And I think they agreed with that right away too. So we got a guy named Jim Levy to come and join us and become the president, and it took off, and it went public and very high price. We didn't get the maximum out of it because because pretty soon the small computer, personal computer, came in, and it would cost about $1,000, and these games cost about $1,000, and fathers rather buy their sons a computer which had the game potential. But those were good days and very informal, and we shared deals with other venture capitalists. I mean, I think that was one of the best things that happened in those days. You'd call, I'd call Tom Perkins and say, "Do you want some of this?" And he'd call me. And in fact, in his autobiography, he gives me credit for bringing the first successful deal that Kleiner Perkins had. They had about 3 lemons. And then I brought them Cume. And that was a guy named David Lee, who had worked at NCR, National Cash Register, and then he had worked at Diablo. We backed Diablo. Again, it was in the drive field, and he had the idea of a daisy wheel printer. And the daisy wheel replaced the IBM Selectric golf ball. And the daisy wheel was a thin piece of plastic, circle, with the letters of the alphabet on the circumference and a little hammer. And it would go either right or left, controlled by a computer, go either right or left, depending on which one was closer. If the E was on the right, it would go right, and if the E were on the left, it would go left. So it was very fast. And took off, and we eventually sold that to International Telephone and Telegraph at a very large gain, and Tom participated along with us.
In fact, didn't he say at one point that that deal probably saved them, because if they'd had one more...
No, there was another deal.
Is that okay?
That was not the one he talks about in the movie. Yeah. No, that's a different one. Jimmy Trybig's company.
That's right, Tandem.
Tandem.
Did this ecosystem of sharing deals and talking to each other as investors, did it just develop naturally? Was this just something?
Yeah, because we were, we shared the work. We shared the deal flow. And most times we weren't all that big, any one of us, where a couple of $1 million invested wouldn't move the needle, which we didn't have that phrase in those days. Today, I was with Dick Kramlich yesterday, and he runs a $3 billion company, and Cume might not have moved the needle for that NEA. So they have to have it all. I mean, everybody gets greedy when they feel that, God, we don't want this to get away, because we need it all in order to move the needle. That attitude was there. We were all new in the business, and therefore sharing ideas and helpful to one another. And just board participation, keeping up with technology and what was changing. All of those factors came into working together, and what was it, a Chinese Hulu, or what was it? There was a phrase for the way working together to make an investment of individual. Anyway, many angels do that today in getting together, but you find very few of the big venture firms want to share anything today. They feel they've got to do it all themselves.
The principles that you learned about what is likely to make a successful venture in those days, I don't know whether this comes out of your experience with Sutter Hill or your total experience, Bill, but in the book you boil it down to what it takes. You talk about the funders, the team, the pitch, the product, the market, the deal, and then the relationship that you build. Was that really essential in this Sutter Hill period in particular, or did you come to that during that time?
I have always been good at selecting people. I told you that pick my wife in 3 days.
Right.
So I've always been comfortable at sizing up people. And so that has always been my focus. I told you I'm not a technology geek, and I'm sorry I don't have a technology background because it would have been helpful. But therefore, the first thing I think about is who's going to run that show, and does he or she have the vision, the drive, the stamina, and the enthusiasm, and the commitment, the knowledge about the territory they're going into. That I have to say, I ask other people to help me figure out whether they are on the right track technically. But if they're a little fuzzy on the details of almost anything about the business, it worries me. And the leadership potential, even though they hadn't led something before, you could see empathy or interest. Guys like Steve Jobs and the president of Oracle, they all have a lot of empathy. No, but you do need that ability to collect a team and lead and follow. And people follow with Steve Jobs because he's decisive and clear-headed and knows where he's going. And so that is certainly a characteristic that can make for a great leader. And so would I want to work for this person is some of the question I ask. Or would I feel, I think he's a good guy to drink beer with, but I don't think I'd follow him across the river. And so all of those things are most important to me more than anything else. If you ask Don Valentine the same question, he'll say the market is the most important thing. And I imagine if you if you asked Tom Perkins, he'd probably say the product and focus in. I mean, he was very active in the very early laser. He took me over to show me the very first laser I had ever seen, and I think existed. There was they didn't know what they were going to do with the laser, but they had a very interesting product, the coherent light. So I'd say I'm much more focused on the people and the team, and if that looks good, I figure they'll pull us out of the wrong territory and redirect it. And presumably they know a lot more about this area than I do, so I'll never be able to figure that out better than they do, than they have it, if they're good.
And I guess your Apple story is also an indicator that you can't spend a lot of time worrying about the ones that get away, right?
No, but we are fishermen in a way, and they are the ones that you remember, and you wish they hadn't gotten away. And you always have kind of an excuse, I guess. I was not looking for a domestic investment when I came back from public service. And Robin Richards and I got together. She was still at Stanford Business School. She was an undergraduate. She was a second-year Stanford Business School student, and we were partners before she graduated. And we wanted to go to India because I had been chairman of the Export-Import Bank and Undersecretary General of the United Nations in charge of UNDP, and seen the world. I've been to 101 developing countries and raised money from the rich countries to give to poor countries. I felt like Robin Hood a little, and I knew the world. So I wanted to do something in venture capital, the only business I knew, internationally. So we picked India. And in the very earliest days, Robin, still at Stanford, told me this guy, Jerry Yang, is doing some interesting things. Everybody seems excited about what he's doing. And so why don't you talk to him? So I had breakfast or lunch with Jerry, but I brought Tim Draper over because he had started Draper Fisher. It wasn't yet Draper Fisher Jervison. And we met with Jerry Yang when he was 26 years old. We went over to Stanford to see what it was he was talking about, and his partner Dave Philo asked me, Tim and I went at different times. I went with another. They wanted a CEO. And we thought that's very good because they probably needed one. And Tim's idea was a guy who was the son of Sandra Day O'Connor, Jay O'Connor, and a good friend of Tim's. And he was at Intuit. So that was, that came a little later. Dave Philo, when Jay O'Connor and I went to look at the product, Dave said, well, you know, what do you want to know? And I said, well, what do you mean, what do I want to know? Well, what do you want to know? Well, what's the I was on the board of Yale at the time. What's the tuition at Yale? So he hits a few keys, and the Yale web page comes up. Well, a web page was, I mean, there weren't too many that he even had such a thing. And then he types a little more, and sure enough, the tuition comes up, $21,000. And I was in awe. And Tim immediately, I think, saw the excitement of this thing, went over to Stanford, saw it in the engineering. I also did that, saw those banks of computers at Stanford. There wouldn't be a Silicon Valley without Stanford, I think. I mean, we plunked our Draper, Gaither Anderson on the Stanford campus. So did Hewlett. I mean, Hewlett-Packard was brought together, Hewlett and Packard, by provost, the provost.
Fred Terman.
Fred Terman. And, you know, this could be called Terman Valley, because if there was any one person responsible for leading it to where it is, I think he's got it, but of course thousands of people are responsible for building it into such a great creative place. I think anybody who, and it's probably way ahead of where it was then, because that was 15 years ago or something, to see these banks of computers, and then Jerry Yang saying, again, it was the second time I've been there, what do you want to know, or would you like to see some real estate in Hillsborough? and picture of a house comes up in Hillsborough, and I thought, geez, this is fantastic. Tim thought this was fantastic. And we thought Jerry Yang and Philo were fantastic. So there was never a question we wanted to invest, but I was focused on India and going to India and getting the India fund. I hadn't gotten the money together yet for the India fund. I had to put my own money in, but I did have enough to write $1 million check to Jerry, which is what I should have done, and said, wherever you go, whatever you do, take my money with you. But I didn't do that. Tim at Draper Fisher Draper Fisher made an offer, but Sequoia outbid him, and also I think the selection of CEO that they had, I think hit it off, connected better. Tim Kugel, I think. So our there's another one that got away. So when you're a fisherman, you remember those fish that got away. Yeah. But you know, we've caught so many that you can't feel bad. I mean, we've been really lucky. I was the first investor in OpenTable, and in that case, I kept advising the guy, because I knew it was checking with every restaurant. They all loved OpenTable, and I ate out a lot with my wife around San Francisco, and I kept saying to the CEO, Thomas Slayton, instead of $1 a piece for every reservation, why don't you charge $2? Bill, you don't get it. I want to own San Francisco. I don't want even a smell of competition. And so $1 is just right to get. And then he opens in Chicago and in New York and now in London and all over the world. And OpenTable is a household name in a lot of places. He was right. But he did need a lot more money because they own those computers that are at the storefront every time you go there. And they don't lease them. I said, why don't you lease them and get the cash out? And so it doesn't become such a, a cash-heavy operation, because we want to make our cash run as far as possible. Bill, you don't get it. I want to own that, and so he didn't take any of my advice. And that is, I always say, this entrepreneur and the venture capital work together. The venture capitalist gives good advice and strategy and all this, and the entrepreneur benefits from all that He didn't take any advice, and I'm glad he didn't, because it became a terrific success and publicly owned, and Goldman Sachs took him public and so on.
So let's talk a little bit about your public service now, Bill, because you at the height of success with Sutter Hill in 1981, you're asked by the Reagan administration to take an important post, and you do it. You walk away essentially from venture capital at that point.
Yep.
Why did you do that?
My learning curve was flattened out pretty well, and I think it really goes back to my father's service in the government, and I felt that was a missing piece in my life. I think that I loved Sutter Hill. I loved the guys I was working with. I think it might have been a stronger company today if I had stayed, but I don't know that. And they've done awfully well since I left. And I held on to all the stocks that we had invested in, because we have in Sutter Hill a unique system, which is evergreen system, where you don't have a term to the end of a fund. Every other one of these venture firms has a Fund 1, Fund 2, Fund 3, including Draper Fisher Jurvetson, but not Sutter Hill. And I think that's the best way, because it aligns the generals with the limiteds much more. Sutter Hill, Genstar got bought out in a takeover. I think it was British Tobacco, and they didn't want to do venture capital. So Princeton, Yale, Stanford, and MIT, we had all gone to those colleges, took it up. They all bought the Genstar stock or position in Sutter Hill, and they've never sold it. But every 4 years it's valued, and they have the opportunity to get out, and they don't want to get out. The returns are good, and because the stock, when a stock goes public and it gets a little overpriced, the general partners will sell it. They won't distribute it typically, and they'll sell it because they know it's high, and then they reuse that money. And so half of the money in Sutter Hill today is owned by the general partners. And it's a much more connected system between generals and limiteds. In the other system, it goes for 10 years. Let's say a fund goes for 10 years, and young partners come in. This is the relationship between the junior and the senior limited partner. The junior partners, they want to get this fund done because they'll have a bigger piece of the next fund. And so they'll sometimes not do the best thing for the organization to just move that money out. Whereas in the evergreen system, they're more conservative maybe, but they're also, well, the returns, when I was there for 20 years, were 41% per year IRR. And today they're in the 30s, but maybe low 30s, but it's very high. So everybody's happy, and it's like Princeton, Yale have their own management running their own venture capital operations, and everybody's working for the return, for the carry, not the fee. You know, some of these get so big, and they're just working for the fee, but the carry is the big thing in Sutter Hill. So anyway, that's the background there. I don't know how it might have ended up if I had stayed. But from my own personal standpoint, I'm very glad I did it, because I got to know the world, got to know how Washington works. I got to know some wonderful people. And when people talk about the government, including my son, who says, you know, we ought to close down the government and start to, and I said, well, what about an army and security? Oh, well, you know, maybe that could be done privately too. But he's not serious. But I am a defender of the high quality civil servants that really think about what is best for the country. Even though that image does not come across, there are really a wonderful group of people that are, I mean, there are both kinds, like like everywhere, but there are really wonderful people who are dedicated to doing a good job as service to their country. And so that's Washington. And then the UN, I worked for 7 years. And that job was the best job I ever had. I was actually the number 2 man in the UN. But the organization is so undervalued in Washington and Keokuk, Iowa. It's just unbelievable how little support we give it. And I mean that financially, resource-wise. And I learned that they are doing so many good things. Because they're an association of nations, they speak with real clout, but they don't have many resources, so they're spread so thin. Whereas if if Bechtel treated the Chamber of Commerce in San Francisco the way Washington treats the UN, it would be a very weak organization. But it does good things. Chamber of Commerce for Bechtel and the UN for the US, but the US doesn't really reciprocate, I don't think, nearly as much as it should. Anyway, having said all that, it is weak. It lacks sophistication. It lacks any kind of PR operation. I mean, that kind of transfers from Norway to Japan, and somebody is running it, but basically the public relations is very, very weak. They ought to just get a couple of guys from Procter & Gamble to take it over and help us build up that organization. But I loved the job. The UNDP that I ran had about 8,000 people in it, 1,000 of whom were in New York. They came from every country in the world because we really had to spread them out. And the other 7,000 were managing projects on the ground, probably about 8,000, 10,000 projects that were sort of the software of development. We are the largest grant aid organization in the world. The World Bank is a larger aid organization but they lend the money, and they do the hardware, I would call, of aid. They build the dams, the power plants, the schools, the highways, that kind of thing, and lend the money, and it comes back. We grant the money for programs like nurses teaching programs, or school projects, or health programs, environmental programs. I mean, there's World Health Organization, and we work very closely with them. There's an environmental program of the UN environmental development. But but we have programs that come close to those. Forestry, a whole series of software kinds, programs that are much more, hands-on, but not the building blocks of buildings and projects of that type. We had, well, I'll give you an example. We gave $6 million to Mohammed Yunus, and he started the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. I went to visit that operation and everything, and that was an early $6 million for him. So it was a very important thing. And he's later gotten the Nobel Prize and kind of stamped the micro-lending as a very important development tool. And then, by the way, later in my own foundation, Draper Richards Kaplan, we backed a company called Kiva.org, which is kind of based on that, except it uses technology. It uses the internet to make, you can make a $25 loan to a tailor in Ghana, and he'll pay you interest, and it'll hang out there, and as long as you want it to, you can pull it back or keep it out there, and it's all organized by a guy who helped found PayPal and another partner.
And did your association with Grameen Bank and Mohammed Yunus, did that
help me figure that out?
Help you understand that was a good idea?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What Kiva is a wonderful thing.
And so that's an example of the kinds of projects that we did.
So you seem to have come home, I use that term loosely, from that with real respect and admiration for what that whole sector of the world does, the UN, this Import-Export Bank.
I think countries that stifle the private sector are shooting themselves in the foot, but without a public service sector, without a nonprofit sector, without dedicated people who are working on problems that will never be good return on investment as an investment. Education is a good example. It's very hard to make that. And I mean, people have tried and do make some money in different little periphery parts of the education area, but basically that is got to be a government, finance government managed kind of thing, local better than national, of course. I've gotten to respect people who work in those territories. A guy like yourself. I mean, you're doing something for a lot of people, and you have no idea the impact that you have. Like a teacher, you know, and their graduates very often end up having had a major impact on the world, and they never knew about it because somebody that they taught and helped along ended up having a huge impact. Maybe long after they're dead, I don't know. But it's a very interesting thing, the way the world comes together, and so you need both. You need both, and I don't think I would have had that attitude, or certainly I wouldn't have felt as strongly about it if I hadn't worked in the public sector and then worked in the international organization sector, like the UN. And you know, I've been to Burkina Faso. Ouagadougou is the capital, and the farming is a problem there, and we help them with seed programs. And I've been out to a little village in the middle of Tanzania, working with a pump that is cheaper than anything else, and simpler to assemble and disassemble by women, and had them all huddle around, and so excited about seeing this pump made in India. And these were a project UNDP had, and now there are probably 1 million pumps of that type being used in Africa, and we kind of arranged the connection between the Indian manufacturer and I mean, there are all kinds of programs that couldn't get there just through a private sector. The risk is too great, and government itself, we talk about the internet, but DARPA really got going on that, and I'm not sure, I mean, it would have come, but not as quickly probably without DARPA. And another example of how government is important is the jet engine. I mean, if that would not have been able to have been built by Boeing alone. It was huge investment to develop the jet, and that was a government project originally, and of course, eventually the jet airplane is taking everybody everywhere, and it's very exciting. And so this working together between government and private sector and international relations and international organizations like the World Bank, the UN, and many others that you never heard of are exciting. I just came from the Global Philanthropy Forum, which I was involved in the starting of. Jane Wales, who's chairman of the World Affairs Council of San Francisco, runs it. And they have 450 people there meeting together, and they come from all over. They had Bill Clinton speak a few years ago. They had Mrs. Clinton last year. But more important than that is that they associate, and it connects the big foundations, smaller family foundations, and a variety of these nonprofit young companies very often, together with, I was talking with the head of Save the Children there, Charlie McCormick, today. They all mix it up. Melinda Gates was down here giving a talk and telling how the Bill Gates Foundation, what they were looking for, and they're now totally supportive of this Global Philanthropy Forum. It's only 10 years old. This is the 10th anniversary. That is doing so much good, and it's connecting people. I mean, let's face it, we learn from each other so much more than we learn, at one level, than we do from, somebody who preaches on high.
Have you found your life as a philanthropist, that part of your professional pursuit, to be as satisfying as you have the venture side of it?
I get that question, and honestly, my answer is I have thoroughly enjoyed every stage of my life. Each one seems to be a good fit for me. It's taken, some people say, I wrote a book this last year and a half. I got to get it on the record. It's called The Startup Game.
Yes.
And that was a totally new experience for me. But I did it on airplanes on a yellow pad of paper, longhand, airplanes and on vacations. And it took about a year and a half, and I got an agent. I hired a young gal to do some research, Yasmin Denari.
I met her.
She's
very
terrific.
Impressive. Yeah.
She's terrific. And she's now at Stanford Business School, first year. And she did some research, and then she said, you got to get an agent. The agent got me a publisher, Macmillan, and Macmillan gave me a deadline, and that's why I got a book done. But all of that was a learning experience for me. So I have gone, steel business, learning curve like this, and flattens a little, venture capital with Draper, Gaither Anderson, brand new, and then with Pitch Johnson on my own, and Sutter Hill, a totally different experience, and then off to the government, and I'm at the U.S. government, and this is my learning curve. This isn't my talent or anything climbing, it's my learning curve. And that's what's exciting, because you don't run out of, as you know, because you've done this a bit, you don't run out of money if you're lucky, but you do run out of time, and you want to have tried as many things as interest you. When your learning curve begins to flatten, it's a good time to change gears. Now, a lot of great inventors and computer scientists that you deal with, you know, they don't run out of, their learning curve doesn't ever flatten out, because they're constantly working on new things and exciting things, and so they may not understand what I'm talking about. Why would you leave if you could invent something else? And that's very interesting. And even when the whole thing doesn't work and they've spent 5 years on it, they've learned something and they know that that's exciting. But I can't honestly put one sector of my life together any 5 years and say that was better than any other. But they were all good. The UN experience was pretty phenomenal, because I got to meet probably 50 or 60 heads of state, maybe more, and got to 101 developing countries, got to know and was far more compassionate than I had been before doing it. Got to know villagers as well as people in the capital cities, and got to see the flaws as well as the potential in the UN and the delivery that it is giving, and the very fine people that my deputy at UNDP had been the head of the Jamaican airline, and before that, head of the Central Bank of Jamaica. So he was no small, cheap bureaucrat. He was a very tough, good, wonderful personality, and very helpful to me. And in my first days there, particularly first years there, and you see some lemons, and you learn a lot about the world, and there is corruption, and you have to grit your teeth and try to do something about it, but it's but you can see you don't really have any. Well, I hired Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Now, you don't know who she is, but everybody in this meeting that I was at, Global Philanthropy Forum, not everybody, but a lot of people knew her. She is currently the president of Liberia. I hired Ellen into the UN Development Program, and asked her to run my African operations. She had had some experience at the World Bank, and then she was kind of between things. I met her in Paris, and I said, Ellen, you got to do this. It's going to have more impact for you than any single job you could possibly have, I guarantee you, because you're going to get, you'll really get a command view of Africa, and it will do you good. Anyway, she spent 5 years there doing a wonderful job. Tough woman, and but charming, and she's written a book. I've forgotten what the name is now, but she anyway, the first day she got into office, she went down to the Treasury Department where she had worked in Liberia. She fired everybody personally. She's that tough. She personally fired every one of them, and she said, I know what you're doing, and it's totally corrupt. You're out of here. I'm going to start over. Then very recently, she fired her whole cabinet and said, I will rehire you one by one, some of you, one by one. So there's a woman that should be on the front page of every magazine, because she's really amazing talent. And that company was very corrupt and in war, and that crazy guy that is under criminal investigation right now.
Yep. So when you look into the future, what do you see?
Well, to be honest about it, and whenever I'd say to pitch Johnson, well, honestly speaking, he said, aren't you always honest? But to be honest, I am not a great visionary, and I don't pretend to be. But judging from the past, I will probably say what a lot of other people would say that have experienced it. We are at the very beginning of this relationship between venture capital and entrepreneurship. We are just kind of learning, and trial and error has taken us to where we are now. Too much money chasing too few deals. Instead of 40 or 30% IRR, it's maybe you'll get your money back at the end of 10 years if you're a limited partner of some funds. Maybe you'll get 2x, and that's not good enough to be sustainable. But there's an ebb and a flow to the demand and the supply. The money has flown in. I knew we were onto something at Sutter Hill in a small office when John Weinberg from Goldman Sachs, he was running Goldman Sachs at the time, came into my little office here on El Camino and said, I'd like to learn more about what you're doing and all this. And I thought, something's going on here. Our returns must be better than they are in Wall Street or something. And sure enough, they were. I mean, they were really, I didn't realize how much better. And of course, anyway, the tsunami of Wall Street money came into Silicon Valley, and that destroyed the returns, but only momentarily. I think it's an ebb and a flow, and so we're just at the beginning of a great future because technology is moving so fast, it's accelerating at such a rapid pace, and machines are talking to machines now, and keeping up and guiding it properly is very important, and it's going to take a lot more sophistication than we've had in the past. But that will come, and there'll be adjustments, and there'll be the Steve Jobs of the world who will break through every barrier and dramatically change everybody's life. There'll be the Zuckermans who will come from Harvard undergraduate out here because the ecosystem is so strong that this was the place to start Facebook. There'll be very strong support system from Stanford, and it grows on itself. I mean, the money is pouring back into Stanford. Stanford keeps getting the best of the best. When I was at Yale taking history, the guy who taught me history was picked as president of Yale in 1950 when I was there. And he had the idea that engineering was like dentistry, and we really ought to just teach biology and chemistry and physics, and try to do very well there. But engineering is like dentistry, so they cut back the budget just at the time that Terman was turning up the heat and leading Stanford to be the best and strongest engineering college in the country, in the world. So I think MIT might have some problems with that, but you know what I mean. In other words, really a dramatic change and difference and so Yale has been scrambling. Guy who went to Stanford undergraduate is running it, is Yale's president right now. And he's trying to rebuild that engineering and doing his best, but we'll never catch up now. We were quite even at the time in 1950. Two organizations were very even. But all I'm saying is that when this technology, which is moving so rapidly, computers talking to computers, you're going to have dramatic changes that you and I can't possibly imagine. And I don't pretend to say, well, what's next? Asked that a good bit, and I always point to my own body. You know, there are wars going on in that body. There are the good guys and the bad guys, and they're fighting constantly. And we're learning more about the brain. We've learned more about the brain in the last 10 years than we've learned in the history of man. And so a lot of the future will be the exciting returns that will come back into our, figuring out what's going on in the body and how to make people healthier and smarter and live longer and get to the poverty level. I think that's an important element of this, and that takes organization, but it also takes technology. I think it's so exciting that Facebook and Twitter and Skype and all really were the platform on which people communicated to overthrow Mubarak, and is now making a change. I don't know what will happen in Libya or in Syria, but it's all pretty darn exciting. And Tunisia's already changed. Now that would not happen. And I could never have imagined it to happen a year ago. None of us would have dreamed that this would have happened. So I think it's a good plug for democracy. I think that's why we went to India rather than China. We liked the rule of law, democracy, and so on. And I think like the food better. But China has proved, and I met with Deng Xiaoping. You asked about how it's affected my life. I think one of the most exciting men I've ever met was Deng Xiaoping. And he was there. I was with the Secretary of Treasury, Don Regan, at the time. It was my first trip to India after I'd taken over shortly after I took over the Export-Import Bank. And he told us that he had already changed in Szechuan the way in which they could do business. They could only grow for the Iron Rice Bowl, grow rice for the Iron Rice Bowl when he took over from Mao. And he said then they were all poor. Now they're all rich. This was only a few years later. And now they're all rich because I told them they can grow anything they want. Now they're growing tobacco and cotton and in the dry areas. And I told them they could trade with anybody they want. They can do it. And of course we applauded and thought that was great. Moreover, I'm going to change the other 14 provinces and let them do the same thing. He did more for entrepreneurship. I say this in the book because it's about entrepreneurship. Deng Xiaoping, you don't think of as doing more for entrepreneurship than anybody else, but he did more because there are more people in China that benefited from his freeing them up from a communist system, even though he still calls it communism. They still call it communism. It's a capitalist system, if I ever saw one, and more entrepreneurs in China than anywhere else in the world, right? So I give him total credit for moving about a third of the world of entrepreneurship and moving it dramatically. So there is no doubt. I met some wonderful people. I know the current Prime Minister of India, and while I didn't have to talk to the government at all when I went to India, it's partially because this man, Manmohan Singh, was elected Prime Minister, and he had been, when I got there to start in 1994 with Robin, first place I went to was to introduce her to the then Minister of Finance, Manmohan Singh. And he had already, in 2 years, he had been there in that job, made major changes that he and I had talked about because he had been head of the Central Bank of India, but he was kind of in a hiatus period, and we both belonged to something called the Tidewater Group. And the Tidewater Group was people who were interested in the developing world and in helping jobs. And I said in one of these meetings in England, we met in Leeds Castle, Kent, England. And I said to him, you know, you got one system, but it's mostly government, called the mixed economy. We believe in the private sector will really drive more jobs. Nobody this morning, everybody was, from some, they were finance ministers or head of the World Bank, me and a few others. And I said, in the morning it was true. No, everybody had talked about what do we do about getting more jobs in the developing world. And I said, so I spoke in the afternoon, I said, listen, nobody has mentioned the private sector. Everybody mentions, the government get more cooperatives going or be better encouraging or whatever. But nobody's mentioned the private sector, and that's where the jobs need to be nourished and developed. And he made a lot of changes right away when he got to be finance minister. And that helped encourage us to go to India too. But I never dealt with Delhi at all. And that was a blessing. In the past, you had to go to Delhi if you were working in Bangalore. As you wanted to be an entrepreneur, you had to go get a license signed by about 25, it's called the license Raj system. You had to get them sign off, and every sign off meant a payoff because it's so goddamn corrupt it was in Delhi. And there's still a bit of corruption there too. And so I was very glad we never had to deal with the government. Never, we were able to avoid any smell of corrupt activity. And it worked out great. My partner and I, Robin and I, got two great partners, Abhay Havalder, who's now with General Atlantic in Mumbai, and the other is Kiran Nadkarni, who's in Bangalore. And they were two great partners, Indian partners. So we had a wonderful experience. We went about every we go about every quarter, and we'd stay for a couple of weeks. And we learned a lot about India, and we'd decide on deals that they teed up for us. And at the end of 6 years, we returned 16 times the limited partners' money. And that was kind of unheard of, and still is, 16 times in 6 years. So we're very proud of what we did in India, but I am sorry that because I was focused on India, I didn't invest in Jerry Yang and Dave Filo. But other than that, it was a wonderful ride, and we got to know a lot of wonderful Indians, a country that's so complicated and fascinating, and we did some good.
So I promised you the last question I was going to ask you was, is there going to be a fourth generation of Draper venture capitalists?
I think so.
You think so?
Adam Draper, Tim's son, oldest son, his youngest son is interested in Hollywood and being I think he wants to be a producer, or he could be an actor. He's a terrific guy. But I think Adam Draper is going to end up in venture capital. He's currently with something called Expert Financial. And Expert Financial is trying to set up a NASDAQ kind of platform for people who want to, private, wealthy individuals want, or at least people who want to own a piece of a private company before it goes public. And he wants to have the trading on that Expert Financial platform. How it will do, I don't know, but he's one of two. He was one of the first hires, And he's working in that territory right now, but I suspect he's going to come into the venture capital community. But as of now, he's dedicated to trying to get that going. And I think I'm hearing more talk about the practicality of it, but I don't know if it'll work or not. They got approval from the SEC to be a system for managing. So if you wanted to buy some Facebook, but the company has to agree. Now Facebook probably won't agree to go on and allow their stock to be traded on expert financial platform.
It sounds a little like second market. Is it?
So you got it.
Yeah, right. Okay. Wow, that's great.
So
Bill, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.
John, it's great to see you again, and I'm glad you're doing this. I'd love to see some of the others.